Now we're ready to start talking about fiscal policy. Policy is basically what we're trying to understand is we have been talking up to now about economic models of the macroeconomy. What drives it? Taxes, spending, government spending, investment spending, consumption spending, savings, interest rates. All these things influence aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we have a model of the economy to help us understand why does an economy get to a certain point and then just kind of pause there, what we call equilibrium, the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. But as we've kind of already noted, equilibrium in the economy may not be a spot we really want to be at. In other words, right at the moment. We might actually be at an equilibrium, but that represents high unemployment, and a lot of people are still out of work. So what are we going to do about it? That's what policy is all about. Should we do anything about it? And if so, what do we do about it? Fiscal policy is the side of economic policy that has to do with taxes and government spending. All right, well, let's think about how these things affect our economy. Fundamentally, what we're talking about are things that will influence aggregate demand directly. So as we've already noted, if the government raises taxes, then aggregate demand, other things equal, is going to shift to the left. If the government reduces government spending, other things equal, it's going to shift aggregate demand to the left. Likewise, we go the other way. If we lower taxes and or raise government spending, that's going to shift aggregate demand to the right. So the effects of fiscal policy, taxes, spending, on our economy enters directly through aggregate demand. Now, if we want to expand aggregate demand, that is, move it to the right, then we would want to lower taxes and or raise government spending. If for whatever reason we want to contract aggregate demand, then we're going to raise taxes or lower government spending. That is fiscal policy. You can kind of refer to what's the proper approach. You can look on page 614 in your text in figures 30.1 and 30.2, and you can see the effects of an expansionary fiscal policy or a contractionary fiscal policy. Now, given that we're probably currently in a state of recession, we have high unemployment, and our focus is probably to try to expand output so that creates more jobs, then the government's proper policy response would be some kind of expansionary fiscal policy. How would you do that? You could do that by lowering taxes, you could do it by raising government spending, or some combination of the two. All right, here's the $64 trillion question. What's the right answer? Well, the right answer probably depends on your interest or your philosophy about government and our economy. If you're more inclined to favor more government intervention in the economy, you believe that's a good thing, then your focus would probably be more on raising government spending. Government directly getting involved in the economy to create jobs, such as was recently passed in the Stimulus Act that was passed in the spring of 2009. So let's build highway bridges, let's build new ports, fix buildings, etc. Spend money and put people to work. Government spending pushes aggregate demand to the right. On the other hand, if you're in favor of perhaps less government intervention in the economy, you might favor lower taxes. That the proper way to get the economy going is to give people lower taxes. That means consumers can spend more money, and that will generate more jobs. Businesses will have more income, and they'll hire more people, and so on. So both of these have both of these actions, lowering taxes, raising spending, have the effects, in theory, in concept, of pushing aggregate demand to the right. How about when Congress passes laws not intended to do anything about the economy? Meaning, let's say for political reasons we want to attack a country, say like when we went into Iraq several years ago. Well, that was going to generate a need for higher tax revenues. Well, one way to finance the war is just simply spend more money and not raise taxes. Well, what happened during the 2000s when we did that? We ran up huge budget deficits because the government was spending more money that they were bringing in taxes. That would be an effect, and it would have an economic effect, but it's not intended to have an economic effect. The war was being run for political reasons, for reasons other than the economy. Well, how about when Congress passes laws directly to affect the economy, such as the 2009 Stimulus Act? Well, that's an act directly designed to affect the economy. What I'm trying to do is differentiate between congressional fiscal policies that are intended to affect the economy versus those actions that are not necessarily intended to affect the economy. Congress has other political reasons for doing it. In other words, how do we know whether we're running budget deficits for economic reasons or other reasons? Well, that's this whole section in your textbook called cyclically adjusted budgets. We're trying to understand, are we running budget deficits or running budget surpluses? And would we have had those budget deficits or surpluses even if we had full employment? In other words, what is Congress intentionally trying to do? Another aspect of this is because of the nature of our tax system and our spending system, our economy has some automatic built-in stabilizers, which is, from an economist's perspective, this is a good thing. Let me explain. So what happens when the economy goes into recession? When the economy goes into recessions, people lose their jobs. Incomes go down. When incomes fall, what happens to tax revenues? The government is taking in less tax revenues. So all other things equal, what happens when the economy goes into recession is the government loses tax revenues and the government's going to run a budget deficit. There was nothing intentional about that. It just simply happens because there's less income, so less taxes. Therefore, if Congress doesn't change spending levels, there's going to be a budget deficit. We're not going to have enough revenues to make up the spending levels. This happens naturally. An economist would say that's actually probably a good thing, meaning tax revenues go down. Well, you want taxes to go down in a recession because you want to stimulate aggregate demand. You want to keep congressional spending levels high, again, to stimulate aggregate demand, to help pull ourselves out of the recession. So this automatic budget deficit is actually, from an economist's perspective, actually a good thing. This is a proper thing and good for the economy. And of course, just all the opposite things happens if we run into like an overheated economy with inflation. Well, what happens? Tax revenues run up, government spending stays at a level, and then we actually can run budget surpluses. Again, it helps stabilize the economy. Again, economists say this is probably a good thing. Finally, another part of fiscal policy we really need to understand is lags. The problem was in 2009 we passed the stimulus plan. Well, that spending didn't take place immediately. It happened over several years. What's going to be the ultimate economic effect of that? Well, that's going to be very, very difficult to measure. Did it have a positive, negative, irrelevant effect? It may be years before we finally understand it because in an economy as complicated as ours, it takes many years for these things to work themselves out. Well, on the same note, when Congress is trying to make decisions about economic policy, how do we know if we're really in trouble? And let me go back. Many of you probably weren't paying attention, but those of us who kind of pay attention for a living, in the fall of 2007, going into 2008, there was a great discussion. Are we heading into a recession? It wasn't until probably mid-2008 into later 2008, well into the recession, before policymakers finally decided, well, yeah, we really are in a recession. Well, it took like several months to acknowledge that we even had a recession. So you have this lag of recognition. Do we even have a problem? The second type of lag occurs when, okay, we have a problem. What are we going to do about it? Well, as you all well know, Congress doesn't make up their minds quickly. It takes them many months and much discussion, hearings, and political conversations to finally come to some decision about, well, what are we going to do about the recession? Do we lower taxes? Do we raise spending? How are we going to do this? So there's a long lag of getting these things decided, an administrative lag, and then finally we have an execution lag. As I mentioned, in 2009 we passed the law, but then it took years before we spent all the money. Finally, the last part of the chapter talks about public debt. And the debt is basically when Congress runs budget deficits, meaning they spend more money than they bring in revenues, they have to borrow to make up the difference. Well, the nice thing about being the U.S. government is that debt has the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. The U.S. economy is huge and extremely prosperous. We are easily the world's biggest economy. So we can afford a huge amount of debt without crippling our economy. So the issue about public debt is not the size of the public debt, it's really how big is the debt relative to our income levels, meaning our GDP. And so far, our public debt as a percentage of GDP is not all that much out of line with other highly developed economies. However, we may be heading toward a higher end of this, and that's why we're having political conversations about this. Another aspect of this is who owns the debt. Who do we owe the debt to? Well, most of the debt we owe it to ourselves. Like when you buy U.S. savings bonds, the government's basically saying we owe you the money. So should we worry about this so much? I don't know. There's a lot of things not to worry about the debt. But there are some things to worry about. One thing is if the debt becomes so large that we have to pay a large amount of interest on it, I mean we, meaning the U.S. government, has to pay a large amount of interest on it, then that will take up a big part of our budget, and that means we won't have money to spend on other things that we probably want to spend our money on. So there is a concern about the debt getting too big. We can't just let it get large forever. But as an economist, let me say, how do we know when it's starting to get too big? The sign will be if the interest payment or the interest rate we have to pay for U.S. debt starts rising, like it did in Greece and now it's doing in Spain and Italy. If that percentage interest rate, meaning the market says we're scared about your ability to repay, that means that interest rate's going to go up on the debt, that's a time to worry. Has that time happened yet? It hasn't happened yet. So at the moment, we don't have to worry about this. But we might have to in the future. All right, these are all the topics to consider in Chapter 30, where we're talking about fiscal policy.